She took one look at the man sitting in the parked sedan and, without thinking, assumed he was the driver. She was wrong. Rain flattened the city's neon into a smear of color, and São Paulo felt like a small animal curled against the storm. Bruna de Oliveira moved through it with the careful economy of someone counting every step. The worn heel that had to last another month, the cheap umbrella that threatened to give up at any gust, the folder clutched against her chest like a shield. Her new job at the company had started that week, secretary to a mid-level department, and the training sessions had run later than promised. Now the light in the office lobby was gone, and the street outside had turned into a river. Her phone buzzed. Rita, checking in from the hospital, a thumbed-out text full of emojis and half-words. Pay attention to the smallest things, Rita had written. Eat, don't skip. Call if you need anything. Bruna typed back a grateful heart, then shoved the phone into the pocket of her coat and focused on finding cover. That's when she saw the car. A black sedan, its paint slick with rain, idling beneath the matte awning of a luxury building. The driver sat very still, hands folded on his lap, an outline in the warm light. He wore a dark coat and a cap pulled low, the brim keeping the rain off his face. To Bruna, he looked like the kind of man who kept to the edges of people's lives, present but invisible, there to open doors, to take a suitcase, to wait. "Do you need a lift?" he called, his voice low but clear, without the drawl of the city drivers she was used to. He spoke English perfectly, with the clipped rhythm of someone who'd spent time abroad. The question was framed like an offer, casual, the kind of kindness that expected nothing in return. Bruna hesitated. Practicality pushed her toward a taxi, pride nudged her to refuse charity. But the rain was slicing through fabric and resolve alike. She accepted. The door opened with a quiet, almost ceremonial sound. Inside, the car smelled faintly of leather and citrus, like a boutique shampoo. He closed the door behind her with the soft click of someone used to handling delicate things. He introduced himself as Rodrigo. There was nothing in his manner that announced wealth. He wiped the rain from his sleeve with the same mechanical courtesy she saw in chauffeurs, salt-of-the-earth manners, efficient and unassuming. When he drove, the car moved like it belonged to the street, not above it. Through the motion and the rain-brushed lights, conversation arrived easily. Rodrigo asked where she lived. She told him, and without thinking she added where she'd grown up. Igarapava, a small town in Brazil's interior. She watched his face as she spoke, looking for that flicker of condescension that city people sometimes wore like jewelry. There was none. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said. "I miss the quiet. I miss my mother's cooking. I miss that. Everything seems to have a time. Harvest, market day. It's predictable in a way that city life can't be." He nodded. "Predictability can be a comfort, but the city is where things happen." She laughed, a short thing that faded into the rain. "Not always good things." He didn't contradict her. For a long stretch they talked about small things, the sharpness of coffee at dawn, how the afternoon in São Paulo smelled like car exhaust and orange blossoms, how elevators had a language of their own if only you listened. He asked about her job with a quiet curiosity, not the predatory interest some men displayed toward younger women. When she explained how new she was, how she still kept a list of people's names tucked under her pen, he said, "You're doing a good job of carrying not just pens, but people's days." There it was, the tone that set him apart, a precision, a tendency to name the ordinary in a way that made it feel important. When she asked him what he did, he deflected with a smile and said, "I drive for people." It was true on level and untrue on others. He said it lightly, as if comforting someone who wanted a story to be simple. When they pulled up at her building, a squat block with a stair that complained of every footstep, he waited politely as she climbed two at a time, breath fogging the air. The hall smelled of damp plaster and boiled coffee. The lights flickered, and she fumbled for the key. Inside, her apartment was a single room and a cramped kitchen that had seen better years.
A faded poster of Igarapapa, sunlit sugarcane fields, hung crooked over the couch. Her whole life fit into 2 suitcases and a shoebox of bills tucked under the sink. She offered him coffee without thinking. It's what you did when you wanted to bridge back to normalcy. He accepted. There was something almost ritualistic about making coffee in that place. The hiss of the kettle, the clink of spoons, the familiar scrape of a mug against its saucer. He leaned on the sink like someone with no desire to dominate the space, but comfortable enough to occupy it. The conversation moved from small talk to the edges of things: money, family, choices. Bruna told him about the extra shifts she took, the calls she made to her mother, the plan to send a little money back home each month. She spoke about the fear that she could be sent away at a moment's notice, that the city might decide she wasn't essential. His eyes, dark and patient, looked at her like someone for whom details were not distractions but coordinates. "Why did you come here tonight?" she asked, half joking. The question hung between them like steam. He met her gaze with an honesty she wasn't used to. "To see how people are when they think no one is watching," he said. There was a pause. "To see how you are." The confession was small and oddly intimate. It also had the shape of an omission. He had not said who he was. He had not said why he had chosen to speak with her.
He had, instead, allowed her to hold an image of him that fit the car, someone whose business was to carry others. There was a power in that omission, and she felt it even before she could name it. "You could have been a thief," she said, half laughing. It was the defensive joke people made when they were trying to steady themselves. "Or a good Samaritan," he replied. "Which one are you?" Her voice kept a playful edge, the only armor she had for landing in situations where her footing might slip. "Maybe both," he said, and then, softer, "maybe neither. Maybe someone who wanted one honest conversation." Bruna believed him. Part of that belief was instinct, part was fatigue and gratitude. He had listened in a way that was rare, had asked about her with the genuine interest of someone who had time. He went through her small apartment with a kind of gentle curiosity, noticed the stack of unpaid bills by the kettle, paused at the photo of a younger Bruna on a porch in Igarapava, asked who the boy in the background was. He didn't patronize. He asked about the soil there, remembered the name of the festival she'd mentioned offhand. He offered no opinions she didn't ask for. Before he left, he placed a small card on the kitchen table, a name and a phone number printed on the back of a simple paper square: Rodrigo. She looked at it and felt the absurdity of the moment. A quiet man with a paper card, leaving it like a breadcrumb. "You don't have to call," he said, as if aware of how fragile things could be when offered as favors. "If you do, ask for Rodrigo. Tell him you spilled coffee on his floor." She smiled at the joke, because what else did you do when a stranger made a space for you and left? Gratitude. Then, the honest, slower thought. She wanted to keep the card. Not because she planned to use it, but because it was proof of a night that had felt like someone had reached in and rearranged something inside her. She slept badly that night, not with fear, but with a strange, sedated excitement. The storm had not simply passed, it had rearranged the way the city sounded. The morning light was a pale sheet against the curtains. Bruna dressed carefully, smoothing the coat she'd cheapened with long washes, rehearsing names in her head as if each one required a separate prayer. At the office, the lobby was a different world, glass and polished marble that reflected the city back like a mirror. People moved with a currency she had not yet learned to carry. Her new desk was a small island in a sea of efficient order. Phones, the sterile hush of people who had already learned which side of their shoes to polish for success. Sandra, her supervisor, hovered like a professional cliff, all edges and strict calendars. "You're early," she noted, like a verdict. Bruna settled into the rhythm. 3 calls, 2 packages to log, a meeting calendar to arrange. When she walked the corridor toward the conference rooms, she saw a man step out of the executive elevator, his presence clearing the hallway like a wind. He wore the cut of a tailor who knew which line to accentuate. The people around him, junior managers, vice presidents, bent toward him the way branches bend toward the sun. For a moment, Bruna's world narrowed to that single figure. He was the man from the car. Recognition hit her in slow motion. The face, the measured way he held himself, the same quiet smile that had fit the kitchen light. But here he carried an air that the car had not hinted at, a practiced authority, a way of moving that suggested other people took their cues from him. The leather of his shoes was immaculate. A slim gold pin glinted at his lapel. His name badge read, Rodrigo Alencar, CEO. Her breath forgot how to steady. For a second, she imagined the worst. Scandal, whispers, a swift dismissal for fraternizing with someone who was not who he had claimed. Her fingers tightened on the stack of memos she carried, turning them into something heavy and sharp against her palm. The office had the perfect small cruelty of a place that loved neat explanations. She watched as people shifted, the whisper passing like a current. "Did you see? He was at the entrance. Isn't she the new secretary?" The words hit her with the peculiar sting of being seen in a way she did not choose. Sandra's expression hardened. "Bruna," she said, voice practical and low, "can you stay a minute after the meeting?" Bruna nodded, and the hallway seemed to lengthen beneath her feet. She stood very still until the flow of people resumed, and the man, Rodrigo, was gone down another corridor, already absorbed into a series of prearranged movements. For a time, she simply listened to her heartbeat, unnaturally loud amidst the office noise. At her desk, the memos felt absurdly mundane. Her hands found her phone and scrolled to the card she'd kept from the night before. The paper was still cool in the memory of her fingers. She could call. She could say nothing and let it be something small, a private secret. Or she could do nothing at all, and hope that the city swallowed the moment and considered it a one-off, a meaningless crossing of paths. Before she could decide, Sandra tapped a file against her desk. "Did you speak with him?" she asked, direct and unforgiving. "He gave me a ride," Bruna said, the words tasting like something that might bruise. He left a card." Sandra's eyes sharpened. "And you invited him up?" "I asked him for coffee. He accepted." Sandra's jaw worked. "Do you understand how that looks? We have protocols, visiting hours. Do not put yourself in a position to be compromised, Bruna, not now." Her admonition was practical fencing. Beneath it glinted something sharper. A worry for the company, for appearances, for how quickly a rumor could calcify into a problem.
Bruna's stomach tightened, not from shame, but from the realization that nothing small in a place like this stayed small for long. Then the unexpected happened. The day's rhythm broke into a new, brutal clarity when the intercom pinged. Teresa Vasquez, HR director, the woman who wore pragmatism like armor, requested Bruna in her office. Bruna's pulse bumped against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had prepared for many forms of trouble in this job: the boredom of routine, the sting of correction, the occasional cruelty of an office that demanded perfection. She had not prepared for the prospect of being called into HR for something that began as a favor in the rain. She walked the corridor, the click of her shoes muffled by the carpet, and wondered what the official language would be. Did they call it a breach, an indiscretion, a lapse in judgment? Each possibility unrolled a different set of consequences. Maybe she would be fired for allowing a stranger into her apartment. Maybe they would write a stern letter to her file. Maybe they would view her with a new, cautious eye. Teresa's office had the air of a woman who was practiced at having difficult conversations. Shelves of binders, a framed code of conduct, a pot of succulents that looked like token softness. Teresa looked up, her face an even plane of authority. "Bruna," she began, "sit." Bruna obeyed. Her palms were damp in her lap. She could feel the memory of the night like a warm thing at her throat. "We received a report this morning," Teresa continued. "There was an encounter at the entrance after hours. A member of the executive team was involved. Bruna nodded once, the motion small and automatic. I need you to tell me, in your own words, what happened. Teresa's voice was not accusatory. It was procedural. It sought facts. Facts were Bruna's refuge. She inhaled and spoke. The rain, the car, the coffee, the card. She told it plainly, leaving out nothing that could be called important and keeping nothing that could be called harmless. When she finished, Teresa steepled her fingers and regarded her like someone appraising a document. We will need to take statements, she said. This is by policy. We'll have a neutral party take interviews, review security footage, and compile a report. Bruna felt the cold efficiency of language that left no room for mercy. The room hummed. Am I in trouble? She asked, before she could stop herself. Teresa's expression softened infinitesimally. Not yet, she said. Right now we're trying to understand. For your protection and everyone's, you'll be placed on standby while we review. That doesn't mean dismissal. It means there will be formalities. Will he? Bruna started, then stopped. She didn't know what she wanted to ask. Whether he would be removed from the equation? Whether he would be found to be the passive participant in a misinterpreted interaction?
Whether the man who had sat on her couch and praised her mother's cooking would be exposed as someone with a title that made everything suddenly political? Teresa observed her for a long moment. Given the seniority involved, we have to be thorough. Transparency is the only way forward. Outside the window, the city was a gray wash. Bruna's mind looped through possible outcomes like a cheap record stuck in a groove. The hum of the office felt suddenly intrusive. She could imagine a dozen versions of how the day's next hours might shape her life. One in which she'd be escorted from the building with her reputation tarnished. Another in which things would settle down and life would return to its small, manageable anxieties. A third where her cheap umbrella and chipped mug would somehow become artifacts of a story that transformed her. The problem was, neither of those versions accounted for the man himself. Bruna had thought of him as generous and simple in the same breath because that was what she had needed him to be. Now, Rodrigo, was a variable the company had to account for. Protocols would intersect with personalities. Power would deepen or complicate what had been a small exchange. As she left Teresa's office, a clerk at the reception desk whispered and glanced in her direction. She could feel people's eyes like tiny weights. Sandra's face was a mask of careful concern. Her colleagues had suddenly folded her into the day's drama like an object of speculation, and the intimacy of the night had calcified into a visible thing. Someone of authority had entered her life, and the company could not ignore that. Bruna retreated to the restroom for a moment, hands braced against the sink, breath loud and real. On the mirror, her reflection looked like someone she'd seen in photos with a past she sometimes wanted to forget. The neat hair pulled back, the small mole near her jaw, eyes rimmed in tiredness. She touched the card in her pocket and felt the roughness of its paper. She considered calling Rodrigo. She imagined him in his office, perhaps oblivious to the small storm his presence had set off, perhaps knowing, and she imagined, as she had in the night, that he might have had a purpose beyond convenience. But what would she say? That the company had noticed? That she had been interviewed by HR? That her life had shifted its axis around a man who had chosen to stay unknown? She left the bathroom and the building, returning to her desk because it kept her moving, and found that rumors had multiplied into narratives by the time she sat down. Half the floor had a version of the evening that fit whatever story made the teller look most savvy. Someone suggested that the CEO had been testing the staff, another that this was a breach of security, another that it was a petty scandal. The day threaded through itself like an uneasy dream. Bruna answered calls with a voice that tried for normalcy. At lunch, she sat with Rita on the phone, listening to her roommate reload the conversation with jokes and updates, and letting herself be soothed by the ordinary rhythms of hospital life relayed from a fluorescent ward. Rita's voice was a lifeline. "Breathe," Rita said. "You did nothing wrong. If they make you uncomfortable, say so.
You have rights. As afternoon slid toward evening, Bruna felt that she had inhabited a day too long and too sharp. She had expected fear. Instead, fear sat beside something else, an odd, fluttering hope. The memory of Rodrigo in her kitchen, the way he'd said the word honest like a benediction, lodged into her. She couldn't shake the certainty that the evening was not simply a lapse, but the beginning of something that might rearrange things for her in ways she could not yet comprehend. And then, as the office lights began to dim and the polished surfaces took on the softer hue of dusk, a meeting was called in the main boardroom. It would be short, Teresa said. Procedure would be outlined, statements requested. Bruna left her desk and walked toward the room with a steady, rehearsed stride. The other attendees were a mix of familiar faces and strangers who wore seriousness like a second suit. The door closed behind them with a low, final sound. Teresa outlined the steps: interviews, footage review, written statements, and the tone was clear: transparency, impartiality, and protection. The meeting was businesslike, but beneath the corporate cadence a different current ran: speculation about motives, about how power intervened in even the most mundane human moments. Bruna listened, the words placing themselves into her like pebbles in her shoe. When the meeting dispersed, Sandra stayed behind long enough to offer one small piece of advice. If you need anything, you tell me, but stay cautious. This company looks after itself. Outside, the rain had returned, not the harsh storm of the previous night, but a steady, deliberate drizzle. On the sidewalk, the puddles mirrored the city's neon, and people moved with umbrellas and briefcases. Bruna walked with the card still warmed in her pocket. She did not expect to see him again that day. She did not expect his face to cross the threshold of contingency and become someone else's consequence. But life had grown more complicated. The question now was not whether a man had lied by omission in order to hear an honest conversation, but what the consequences of that omission would be when the man he really was took his place in the structures that kept the city orderly. That evening, when the building had thinned to late workers and the cleaning crew hummed through the corridors, there was a soft knock on the glass of the executive suite. Bruna passed it on her way to the stairwell, and for a breathless second, the world narrowed. Rodrigo stood in the doorway, the floodlights painting his profile in sharp relief. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed the right faces for 1,000 meetings. He saw her and inclined his head, the expression small and private, as if he carried the memory of last night's kitchen like a tiny contraband item. Their eyes met. He walked toward her with a deliberate pace, neither fast nor slow, a rhythm that belonged to someone used to controlling the tempo. As he reached her, his mouth moved, and she heard his name shaped into syllables that no longer belonged to the car, but to a title: Bruna. She was suddenly conscious of everything: her own breath, the dampness of her coat, the frayed hem of her scarf. There was a weight in the air, the sense of two trajectories intersecting and then diverging. She could see in his face the recognition of what had been done, the small deception, the omission. His features tightened with a hint of regret. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words had the plainness of someone confessing a practical error. "I didn't mean to put you in a difficult position. I should have introduced myself properly last night. I thought—" He paused, as if searching for a sentence that could account for both curiosity and misjudgment. "I wanted something honest. He stopped. "It was a mistake to hide who I am." The admission landed like a small stone. It acknowledged the moral ambiguity she had felt in his silence. It did not excuse him, but it shifted something prehistoric. The power that had been implicit in his omission was suddenly put on notice. He had named the wrongness. He had spoken accountability. It made things complicated, Bruna said, the sounds of the words awkward and real. She did not look away when she said it. She wanted him to see the limits of her patience and the breadth of her dignity. He met her gaze, unflinching. "I know. That's why I'm here, because I don't want this to be about me and what I did alone. I want to know how you feel. I want to—" He stopped, as if negotiating for the right to continue.
to make sure this doesn't harm you." His words were precise and not rehearsed. There was a weight behind them, a refusal to let the night be the sole arbiter of consequence. Yet even as he spoke, the business of power intruded. They were two people with very different places to stand in the world, and the world of the office would not allow their small, honest exchange to remain private. Bruna felt her stomach knot. "The company," she said. "They'll take statements. They might put me on standby. I don't want to be the center of something that looks bad." "I know." He held her gaze with a steadiness that was not theatrical. "And I will do what is necessary to ensure transparency. You'll get the respect you deserve, Bruna. That is my promise." There it was, the first of his bold moves. Not a grand gesture in front of cameras, but a private assurance that he would not hide behind his role if it complicated her life. Bruna felt her stomach knot. "The company," she said. "They'll take statements. They might put me on standby. I don't want to be the center of something that looks bad." "I know." He held her gaze with a steadiness that was not theatrical. "And I will do what is necessary to ensure transparency. You'll get the respect you deserve, Bruna. That is my promise." There it was, the first of his bold moves. Not a grand gesture in front of cameras, but a private assurance that he would not hide behind his role if it complicated her life. Bruna felt her stomach knot. "The company," she said. "They'll take statements. They might put me on standby. I don't want to be the center of something that looks bad." "I know." He held her gaze with a steadiness that was not theatrical. "And I will do what is necessary to ensure transparency. You'll get the respect you deserve, Bruna. That is my promise." There it was, the first of his bold moves. Not a grand gesture in front of cameras, but a private assurance that he would not hide behind his role if it complicated her life. It was the shape of power exercised with a sense of accountability, a pledge that his position would not be used to silence or smooth over. She wanted to believe him. Part of her wanted to recoil, to protect herself by distance. Part of her, the part that ate coffee too late and folded itself around small kindnesses like a blanket, wanted to accept the offer of protection and also to measure it for truth. "Thank you," she managed. The words were small but honest. She slid the card from her pocket and held it up like an offering. Rodrigo smiled. Not the public, curated smile of a man who flashed it for boards and photographs, but a softer one that looked like the light at the edge of a dawn. "Good," he said. "Keep it." They stood in the shifting light of the corridor, two people who had met in a storm and now found themselves doing something quieter and harder, trying to navigate consequences. Behind them, the city breathed, indifferent and immense. Inside the company, lines would be drawn, interviews taken, and procedures executed. Outside, umbrellas blossomed and shrank, and São Paulo rolled on in its old, complicated rhythm. When Bruna left the building that night, she walked slower than she had the night before. The rain had stopped. Puddles reflected the shapes of buildings and the occasional cigarette glow like fallen stars. She thought about the card in her pocket, about Teresa's directness, about Sandra's caution, about Rita's soft insistence that she take care of herself. She thought about Rodrigo's apology and the gravity beneath it. She had a choice to make, and it was a choice that would define not only her day-to-day life, but the shape of a future she had only just allowed herself to imagine. Would she let this be a cautionary tale about blurred lines, or would she hold on to the chance that a human error, his omission, might be met with an ethical response large enough to make amends? Across town, in a suite that overlooked the city lights, Rodrigo sat at a desk and pressed his palms against the cool glass. The day had unfolded as he had anticipated and not anticipated. The careful experiment of anonymity had produced something he had not planned for, risk to another person. He felt the gravity of that like a pin placed under his skin. He had intended to test the authenticity of conversations. He had not intended to destabilize a life. He thought of his motives in precise fragments, as if cataloging them might make them less messy. He wanted to shrink the distance between people and him. He wanted to see how a person might respond to being heard without the glare of his title. He wanted to be sure that the people who worked in his building were themselves, not reflexive actors in response to a name. But he also recognized the arrogance in that desire. To slip into anonymity was to play with people's trust. He had chosen to stay in the car. He had chosen to keep silent about who he was.
That choice sat with him now like an unassigned debt. "I crossed a line," he admitted aloud to the quiet room. The confession was not theatrical. It was a recalibration. He made a decision then, small and resolute. When things became formal and the company's gears turned toward investigation, he would not hide. He would step into the center of whatever consequences followed. He would, as much as he could, ensure that the person he had met in a small apartment would not be punished for his curiosity. He would make amends with action. It was the first of many bold moves he would make, and he felt, in that unlit room, both the weight of the promise and the cold clarity of responsibility. He picked up his phone and scrolled, not to the contacts of his board of directors, but to the number on a paper square kept in an unlikely pocket. He hesitated for a moment, the finger hovering over the screen, then pressed call. He left a message for Rita when she answered the second ring, a voice that was careful and reassuring, in a way intended to steady a life he had swayed. "Tell Bruna," he said into the phone, "tell her not to worry. We will handle this properly." Rita's laughter, brittle and alive, crackled through the line. "Who is this?" she asked, not unkindly. "Is this a trick?" "It's Rodrigo," he said, using the name in a way that cut through the pretense like a blade. "Tell her I'm sorry for the trouble." It was a small gesture of accountability, made in the quiet hours, a reparation begun before the forms, the interviews, and the records were even filed. It would not erase the night's omission, but it was a first concrete step, a public promise, if not yet public, that he would not hide behind his title to avoid consequences. Bruna's life, which before the week had been a delicate choreography of bills and shifts and the occasional stolen afternoon with her mother on the phone, had moved onto a new axis. The card in her pocket felt heavier now with the knowledge that a man with power had stepped, awkwardly, into the messy territory of human connection, and had chosen, after the fact, to own the mess. As she climbed the narrow stairwell back to her apartment that night, the city stretching out like a map of possibilities, she turned the problem over in her mind, the company's procedures that would now enfold her, Rodrigo's acknowledgement, the way the office had already begun to whisper. She stepped over the threshold into the dim apartment and set her keys on the crooked console. Outside, the night hummed. Inside, she held a tiny paper square between thumb and forefinger and wondered what would happen next. She turned the little paper square over between her fingers until the edges softened. The city outside her window went on being a collage of lights and distant horns, and inside the apartment the kettle had long since cooled.
Choices, she told herself, were sometimes like kettles. You waited for the hiss, for the moment the water moved, and then had to decide whether to pour or to let it sit. Morning arrived with the same narrowed focus as always, bus schedules memorized, a sandwich packed in a plastic container, the same gray coat. But the rhythm of the day had altered. The tiny card in her pocket felt less like a souvenir and more like an obligation. She made it through the commute by reciting names under her breath, one by one, an exercise in steadying. The interviews began the next day. Teresa's office turned into Procedure Central. Neutral interviewers, taped statements, security footage pulled and replayed with clinical attention. Bruna sat across from a woman who asked questions like a machine learning program, clear, methodical, no leading, while a man with a clipboard took notes as if laying out evidence for a trial that had yet to begin.
Sandra hovered somewhere on the periphery, a watchful presence whose skepticism had become professional armor. Rodrigo told the story differently in his own account. He spoke to Teresa directly, his manner steady and formal, not defensive. He described the car, the rain, the choice to remain unnamed. He used the word mistake clearly. "I should have introduced myself," he said. "I should not have created a situation that puts an employee at risk of scrutiny because of my curiosity." Teresa listened with the impassive expression of someone who has seen 1,000 shades of human error. "Mr. Alencar," she said, "we will treat this matter according to company policy. We require statements from everyone involved. We will document everything. You understand the implications of involving employees in informal interactions." "I do," he answered, "and I accept whatever steps are necessary. I want transparency." There was something in his tone that shifted the room. It was not theatrical. It was a conscious taking of responsibility. That was one of the first unexpected, quiet ways he began to pull the shape of this story away from scandal. He did not attempt to smooth anything with money or influence. He stepped into the process as a participant, not a shield. The company press office, when the possibility of gossip seeped beyond hallway whispers, issued a standard line. An internal inquiry was underway, and the company would not comment on personnel matters. Rodrigo did not hide behind that silence. He requested a meeting with Teresa alone, and then, in a move that startled some of the staff, asked that she consider a different outcome for Bruna. Not punishment, not even shadowing, but a legitimate offer. It had the feel of improvisation at first. Bruna sat in the HR waiting area, fingers twisting the strap of her bag, while Teresa returned with a sheet of paper and a different expression, someone who had weighed options and decided on the one that fit her sense of principle.
"We have considered the variables," Teresa said, sliding the paper toward Bruna. "We have also considered Mr. Alencar's statement and his request. He has proposed an opening for you in his office, a position as personal assistant with explicit terms. HR would be involved at every step. The offer comes with a contract, a clear salary adjustment, a probationary period, and a condition of procedural transparency. You would have the right to accept or decline." Bruna stared at the paper as if it might rearrange itself into a joke. The offer looked like a page from a world she had only seen from the curb. A salary range that promised a significant improvement on her current earnings, formal benefits, relocation allowances for travel to her hometown if needed for the project, and, most notably, an extra line item: primary liaison for foundation project Igorapava pilot. Conditions to be detailed. "Why me?" she asked, because the question sat like an ember in her chest. Teresa's response was practical and brief. Mr. Alencar requested someone he described as honest, grounded, and someone with roots in Igorapava who could help guide a pilot program. He recommended this route rather than any other employment action. Given the circumstances, and given his willingness to proceed transparently, we can offer the position provided you consent. Her hands trembled a little as she read the financial details. The raise would mean rent would be paid on time. Her mother would not have to pick up extra shifts at the market. She could send a little money home every month, and maybe, if things went well, help fund a school program she had only ever talked about. But there was also a clause about reporting lines and conflict of interest. During the first 6 months, all decisions regarding the foundation project would be subject to HR oversight, and a designated compliance officer would be copied on correspondences. Any personal relationship with the principal would have to be disclosed and would trigger a reassignment if necessary to avoid influence. Bruna met Teresa's practical gaze, and then, like a compass finding north, raised her own. "I need to know that my voice won't be silenced," she said, "that this won't become a story that makes me grateful for favors instead of the work." It was an intelligent demand, and Teresa, who had read many face-saving offers, nodded. "If you accept, we will draft a contract that makes your role clear and enforceable. Your duties will be listed, your compensation fixed, and protections in place. You will have access to legal counsel if you want it. Transparency is the cornerstone here." Bruna thought of the night in her apartment, the smell of coffee, the card as breadcrumb, Rodrigo's apology at the door.
She thought of Rita telling her to breathe, of her mother's voice on the phone, of the way the office had already begun to whisper. She folded and refolded the paper with a steady hand, and finally made a choice.
"I will take it," she said, not with giddy acceptance, but with measured intent. She wanted change that was not simply a rescue mission. She wanted a role she could own. Rodrigo learned the meaning of making amends through procedure. In a move that surprised more than a few executives, he signed an internal memo stipulating that the project in Igarapava would be overseen by a committee and that his involvement would be documented. He insisted that Teresa appoint a compliance officer to track decision-making. He publicly apologized in the internal newsletter to any employee who felt their trust had been compromised by his actions. It was not a grand gesture of PR. Nobody on the staff called cameras, but it was an explicit attempt to remove shadow from the process. There were whispers, of course. Office culture is fertile ground for speculation. Some people saw Bruna's new role as a lucky break. Others saw it through an eye of caution. Sandra, whose job depended on the machinery of competence and predictability, oscillated between professional civility and reluctant respect. "You did well in the meeting," she said once, handing Bruna a folder with new contact numbers. "Don't let anyone make you small." "That's not what I'm here for," Bruna replied. "I want to do the work." And that is exactly what she did. The contract was clear: a fixed salary that doubled her previous pay, a monthly allowance for travel tied to the project budget, a 3-month probationary period with measurable goals, and the clause that any personal relationship with Rodrigo would be handled transparently and could require a shift in reporting lines. She negotiated one point: an explicit guarantee that if she were asked to relocate to Igarapava for the pilot, her housing and family support would be covered. Teresa added the wording into the final draft. Bruna signed. The first day in her new role felt like stepping into a room where people already spoke a different language. Rodrigo's office was pared down, glass and walnut, windows that looked like screens onto São Paulo. He greeted her with the same composure he'd shown at the door, but something softer sat behind his eyes, a kind of watchful curiosity now tempered by the lessons of the formal day. "Welcome," he said, and it sounded less like note-taking and more like handing someone an open book. Their work began with lists and calendars. Bruna's notebooks filled with names of stakeholders, dates, budgets, a map of Igarapava's municipal agencies. She found herself on calls with program officers who spoke in acronyms, with local leaders who invoked family histories, and with designers who argued about paint palettes for a community center. The foundation's board preferred metrics and milestones. The community leaders preferred coffee and patience. Bruna found that she loved, always, making the middle ground. Rodrigo, for his part, did not hover. He did not attempt to smooth every bump he saw. He asked precise questions, invited input, and then let her trial solutions. That restraint, knowing when to step back, became one of his most valuable habits. Still, there were moments when his voice carried the authority of a man who had been accustomed to decisions being taken immediately. In those moments, Bruna would draw a line, not in defiance, but with professional firmness, and she would explain why a local leader's voice needed to come first. They began to work long days. A typical afternoon might end with them walking the glass corridors and arguing lightly about the tone of a press release, followed by a replay of a meeting in the executive conference room where Rodrigo would ask, "What did we miss?" And Bruna would answer with the kind of local detail that mattered: a festival date, an aunt who ran a bakery, the name of the teacher everyone trusted. He learned to listen not to the polished line, but to the anecdote. In the spaces between meetings, Rodrigo showed the twinges of solitude that had been hinted at from the start. He kept a small photograph on his desk, a faded image of a beach that might have been a boyhood memory. And sometimes, when the day had been particularly thin, his fingers would rest on the frame as if touching a different life. He confessed, once, to Bruna, voice low as they sorted through a stack of proposals, that he had set up the foundation as a way to keep himself busy with meaning when board meetings offered none. Money, he said, is an instrument. It can build things. It can also keep you from seeing what you need to see. Bruna had a practical answer for that. Money is a ladder, she said, but you need people who will climb, who know the rungs. She smiled, but the smile hid a more complicated truth. Power had to be translated by people who understood the place it was meant to serve. The Igarapava pilot was not immediate. It required planning, permits, budget rounds, and a small army of people who were used to saying no when plans threatened their routines. The first trip to the town, Bruna's trip, with Rodrigo and 2 program officers, happened 3 months into her new job. The dust on the roads was the color of old bread. The market's aroma was deep with cassava and oranges. Bruna's mother met them at the bus stop, eyes wide with the mix of pride and worry only a parent could carry upon seeing their child return in company with a man from the city. "You're the one who keeps her brave," her mother said to Rodrigo in passing, and Bruna felt the sentence like a benediction. There were meetings at the town hall with a mayor who had more stories than cell signal, and afternoons at the school, where the children sang a welcome that had the rough harmony of voices used to ringing out. Rodrigo listened. He sat on wooden chairs and let the humidity press against his suit. He did not arrive with the pretense of saving anything.
Instead, he offered funds, yes, but more importantly, he listened to the sequence of need as the community described it. The center's roof leaking, the teacher's shortage of materials, the farmer's need for a cold storage solution for produce. Bruna moved in that space like a translator of possibility. Her notes were precise. Cost estimates, timelines, names of contractors who had worked with community projects before and would not price gouge. There were moments when the old power dynamics tried to reassert themselves. An influential local business owner suggested the foundation's funds be used for a public plaza that would carry his name. Rodrigo listened, then asked a question that disarmed the room. What will that plaza give back to the people who use it every day? Bruna watched as he placed a hand on the table and argued gently for needs that mattered to mothers and elders. He had learned, during those months, to let his finances be a tool rather than a statement. Back in the city, the office narrative shifted. The early whispers faded when the project's milestones began to read like verifiable achievements. A contract signed with a local builder, a procurement plan that passed compliance, a community committee that Bruna had helped form to oversee decisions. Lucas, a junior colleague who had once tossed a rumor about favoritism into the air, saw the transparent process and, after a terse conversation in which Bruna explained the compliance checks, offered a grudging acknowledgement. "You ran this clean," he said. "That's not common." "It's the only way to make it last," she replied. Months passed like boxes of dates stacked and labeled. There were late nights when spreadsheets needed to reconcile and supply orders had to be rerouted. There were mornings when Bruna woke to a phone full of messages from a teacher in Igarapava who needed ink cartridges for a printer. There were times when she wanted to cry from the relentlessness of paperwork, and Rita would remind her, over a late-night video call, that the real work was always harder than it looked. Rodrigo's involvement deepened in small human ways. He began to invite Bruna into decisions that once would have been delegated. Not because he wanted control, but because he wanted to learn how to do things differently. He spent an afternoon learning how to negotiate with a supplier who preferred cash deals. He found himself listening to the oral histories Bruna recorded during a visit, stories about harvest festivals and the cost of sending a child to school. And those narratives reshaped the foundation's measures of success. There were quiet tests of the relationship, too. An unexpected audit of the project's budget forced Teresa to intervene and demand an explanation for a line item that looked like a personal expense. It turned out to be a legitimate cost, travel reimbursement for a liaison who had accompanied the team to remote villages. But the optics required clarity. Rodrigo accompanied the team to HR, and together they laid out receipts, minutes from meetings, and photographic evidence of work. In the boardroom, he said plainly, transparency is not optional. It was a small political risk, and he took it. Bruna watched the way he navigated those moments and felt admiration leavened with wariness. He had power, yes, but he was learning to use it in a way that invited accountability rather than closed ranks. There were nights when, after a long planning session, they would stand on the terrace of the foundation office and watch the city's lights hum like bees. He would talk, rarely, about why he had started the foundation, a need to create a legacy that wasn't just profit, an attempt to make his life more than quarterly reports. "Do you regret what you did?" Bruna asked once, the question landing between them like a hand. He was quiet for a long moment. The city stretched beneath them, indifferent and vast. "Yes," he said finally, "in the way that matters. I regret that my curiosity created trouble for you. I regret not thinking through the consequences. I regret that, in trying to find an honest conversation, I put a person at risk." It was an honest answer. He did not try to smooth it. Then he added, softer, "I also don't regret meeting you. I regret the method, not the result." That distinction mattered. She accepted the admission and also recognized the complexity. People were allowed to regret their methods and still own their feelings. The months deepened the feeling, the way sunlight sat on his cheek when he slept briefly in an office chair during a crisis, the way his voice said her name with an attention that was almost prayerful. But there were also moments when she felt the weight of being the person who had been chosen. Was she in danger of being a symbol? Of being mistaken for gratitude where competence dwelt? She kept those doubts at the surface of her mind, like stones in the pocket, not to be thrown but to be carried. The boldest move Rodrigo made was not a grand public declaration. It was the way he rearranged his life to match his words. He requested that the board ratify the transparency measures and asked that his involvement in daily operations be limited so that decisions were not centralized. He created a budget oversight committee that included external members. He insisted that Bruna be a voice at the table and that her opinions be documented. But even the most accountable man could not legislate affection. Affection grew in small, inescapable increments. It happened over coffee gone cold during long drafting sessions. It happened in a shared joke about an inscrutable municipality form. It happened in the quiet aftermath of a problem solved. For Rodrigo, who had spent decades measuring people by leverage and outcomes, those small moments rearranged priorities. He began to find himself choosing to be present in ways that made him vulnerable to being seen. The more he was seen, the more he had to reckon. He did not want to be a man who used his resources to buy affection. He wanted something mutual and uncoerced. So, one evening, after a board meeting that ended later than expected, after they'd signed a grant contract that would fund materials for the community center roof, Rodrigo locked his office door, a childish, human gesture, and invited Bruna to sit. "I need to say something," he said, voice careful. Bruna, who had spent months navigating the strange geography of power and service, put her hands in her lap. "Okay." He drew breath. "From the moment we spoke in your kitchen, I felt a connection," he said. "At first I thought it was curiosity. Later I realized it was something deeper. But I also know how dangerous it is for me to make that claim without acknowledging the imbalance. I want you to know the truth. I have feelings for you. But I will not act on them in a way that compromises your agency or your career." Bruna listened to the words with the same focused attention she gave a tricky contract clause. His confession was not a demand. It was an offering coupled with a promise of restraint. "What do you want me to do with that?" she asked. He looked at her with an earnestness that exposed the old lonely edges of him. "I want to be honest, and I want to give you a choice. If you would ever consider a relationship, I would step aside from decisions that affect you directly. If you do not want that,
I will arrange for your role to be transferred to an independent director. I don't want my position to become leverage." There was a silence long enough to feel like an instrument tuning. Bruna appreciated the boundaries he offered. It was evidence he had thought about consequences. But feelings did not pause for formalities. She thought of the months they'd worked, the trust she'd built at the cost of long hours, the nights she had spent fielding calls from teachers in need, the times he'd listened and paid attention, and she measured their relationship not merely by gratitude, but by the steady, mutual labor. "I need time," she said finally. "I need for this to be something we both walk into with our eyes open. If we were to try something, it would have to be after we've untangled these professional lines. But," she paused, feeling the weight of the concession, "I care about you. I care about what we've done here. I don't want your apology to be the end of something honest." Rodrigo exhaled, a long, humane sound. "That's fair," he said. "I asked for honesty, and I promised to accept it. Take all the time you need." They agreed on practicalities. Rodrigo requested that HR formalize the separation of roles if their relationship ever progressed. He would step back from direct approval of the foundation's day-to-day operations. Another director, nominated by the committee, would take that responsibility, while Bruna remained in her liaison role.
It was not a romantic act. This was governance. But it was a bold move in the currency that mattered to both of them, integrity. Time, as it does, did its work. It revealed character and tested resolve. There were moments when their closeness produced envy among others. There were board members who worried about optics and community leaders who suspected a romantic narrative might eclipse the project's aims. Each time, they tackled the issue with the tools they'd built: transparency, documented decisions, external oversight. Then, on a late afternoon some 9 months after that rain-slick night, they were alone in the project warehouse, a cavernous space filled with pallets of donated books and stacks of painted chairs. The team had just signed a supplier contract that would finally give the school its long-promised library. The whole project felt, for a few hours, like a breathing thing that had been knitted together by many small hands. "Do you remember the card?" Bruna asked suddenly, because memory likes to anchor itself to objects. Rodrigo smiled. "I do. I keep terrible mementos." He came closer and picked up a tattered paperback catalog. Somehow it had the same green as the paper used in Bruna's first notebook. There was a gentleness in the air that had nothing to do with boardroom language or compliance. They had both earned, through months of labor and honesty, the right to a private moment. He reached for her hand, not in a theatrical seizure, but in the careful way a person asks permission with a touch. She did not pull away. "I didn't plan the way I feel," he said, voice small in the warehouse's wide mouth. "I tried to control everything. I am trying less now. What I feel is real, but I don't want it to be the kind that leaves a stain." She looked at him with the steadiness of someone who had lived in both scarcity and surfeit. "I can't promise to be anything other than honest," she said. "I won't be a symbol or an apology. If we are to be together, I need to know it will be because you choose me when you are not just making amends, but because you want the person I am." "I choose you," he said without hesitation, "not because of what you bring to the foundation, but because of who you are." She let that settle like rain into earth, and then, after a moment that felt both small and monumental, she leaned in. Their kiss was careful and brief, and the kind of thing that testified to months of boundary setting and mutual consent. It was not a collapse into desire, but the meeting of two people who had chosen each other after accounting for consequences. They did not hide. In the days that followed, they notified HR of their relationship in accordance with company policy. Teresa, who had been there since the beginning, arranged a formal recusal that shifted direct oversight of Bruna's role to a committee head who had no personal ties to Rodrigo. It was procedural and necessary.
The board accepted the changes with the cool deliberation of people accustomed to governance, and the Community Oversight Committee applauded the transparency. Life, reorganized, did not become effortless. Relationship and work required renegotiation of schedules, continuous attention to optics, and constant reaffirmation that the project's goals remained the point. But the bold move Rodrigo had made, first to apologize, then to establish transparent measures, then to disclose his feelings while proposing structural remedies, had set the terms for a relationship that could be mutual without being coercive. In Igarapava, the pilot project opened in a way that felt less like a ribbon-cutting ceremony and more like a communal claim. The roof was fixed on the community center, school supplies arrived in neat boxes, and the chosen cohort of farmers received training and the first cold storage unit. Bruna watched as children signed their names in a freshly purchased ledger. Her mother, standing in the back with a shawl around her shoulders, kept pressing her fingers to her chest as if measuring each breath. On the day of the celebration, the mayor took the microphone and said, in a voice that had a humor reserved for people who live with the weather, "When people from the city bring something that fits, it's because someone in town made them look." He glanced at Bruna, and the crowd laughed, because it was true. Bruna had been the conduit. Rodrigo stood to the side, his hands folded, his face soft. After the speeches, he caught Bruna's eye and mouthed something that did not need translation. She smiled back and felt that, for once, her life had been arranged not by survival but by choice. The months that followed the project's pilot year were not without complication. Funding cycles tightened, a supplier delayed a shipment, and there was a brief spell of local politics that made the board nervous. But the foundation had planted seeds that could be tended, and the team, Bruna included, had shown a capacity to steward them. The project expanded to include job training and a microgrant program for small businesses. Bruna began to travel less and coordinate more, building systems that would survive her absence. Her relationship with Rodrigo continued to be negotiated in daylight. They scheduled regular check-ins with HR to ensure no conflict of interest surfaced, and they agreed, privately, to revisit the terms of their work if either felt the lines between personal and professional were blurring. They took vacations that did not intersect with the foundation schedule to preserve the integrity of both their work and their private life. They learned, in the small ways of domesticity, each other's rhythms, how Rodrigo liked his coffee black at dawn, how Bruna favored late-night cups with condensed milk. One afternoon, nearly a year after the rain, Bruna walked through the refurbished community center in Igarapava.
Children scrawled on a chalkboard, elders sat in a circle telling stories, and a row of newly built bookshelves held titles that were more than decorative. A mural, painted with the town's festival colors, ran across the wall. Bruna pressed her palm to its cool, drying paint and felt the steady thrum of accomplishment. She had thought, many nights ago, that such a scene would be a dream that belonged to someone else. Instead, she realized that dreams, when married to work and proper accounting, could be real. When the Foundation's annual report came out, it listed accomplishments in sober language, but also included, in a small sidebar, testimonies from people whose lives were different now. Bruna's mother wrote a paragraph about the way the market had more customers and how she could take a day off once in a while. Rita video called on a Tuesday night to say someone had complimented the bread at the market. Bruna read the testimonies slowly, savoring them like letters. The office in São Paulo became a place where she moved with confidence. Sandra offered an occasional piece of advice on presentation decks and, after one tense budget conversation, gave her a hand-me-down scarf and a nod of respect. Lucas, the junior colleague who'd once been a skeptic, asked Bruna to mentor him on a small outreach project. She did, and in teaching him the careful translation between community need and corporate compliance, she found a new kind of pleasure. Rodrigo changed too, in ways that were more internal than visible. He stopped collecting certain kinds of trophies, a portfolio of influence, and began to keep a gallery of letters from farmers who wrote about a cold storage unit that stopped spoilage, or from teachers who could now stock their art supplies without delay. He learned to be publicly accountable without resentment. He took phone calls from board members with the patience of someone who had learned that listening was work. Their romance, when it moved beyond the whispered sentences in a glass corridor to a partnership and later to a small domestic life shared between meetings, felt not like the center of the foundation story, but like one of its byproducts, the proof that people could connect across worlds in a way that honored dignity. They did not marry quickly or theatrically. They took their time, two people mindful of consequences, each walking toward the other with both hands visible. The most important measure of the year was not the size of donations, but the change in habit. The committee continued to meet, and the community oversight remained in place. When town leaders asked for a new initiative, an apprenticeship program for young carpenters, Bruna and the committee opened a call for proposals and appointed a neutral administrator to oversee selection. The same mechanisms that had protected Bruna now protected the process itself. One evening, as the sun leaned toward the horizon and the city seemed to inhale for the day, Bruna walked down a street that no longer felt hostile. The rain that had once been a scissors to her shield was a memory that now lent texture to the moment. She paused in front of a cafe and, on impulse, ordered a coffee and sat by the window. Outside, the world moved. A delivery bike, a woman pushing a stroller, a man laughing into his phone. Rodrigo joined her a moment later, not as a boss or a hidden man in a car, but as someone who had walked a long, complicated road to arrive beside her. He sat down and reached across the table, his fingers finding hers. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said, and she could feel the whole of their story like a spine, sometimes fragile, sometimes strong. Not as a single night, but as the start of things that took a lot of work. He nodded. "I hoped for an honest conversation," he said. "I didn't expect to find a life." They laughed, both aware of the improbability and the choices that had made it possible. Outside the window, a downpour began, soft and familiar. Neither needed an umbrella. Inside, the cafe smelled of rain and coffee and the ordinary spice of human lives that are, by choice, shared. If you love a twist that turns lives upside down and becomes, in time, a careful rebuilding, like this story, and keep watching for more where small decisions make big differences. The Foundation's pilot program in Igarapava eventually scaled not into a museum of pity or a shrine to philanthropy, but into a network of projects that the town managed with newly found capacity. Bruna's mother opened a small pastry stall near the market that paid its bills. Rita, who had always given so much to others, took a weekend to travel for the first time in years. The team in São Paulo continued its work, now seasoned by the lessons of a small town that insisted on dignity. Years later, when they told the story in interviews or casual conversation, they never stripped it of its complexities. Rodrigo always began with the same sentence: "I made a mistake in how I started." Then he described, with the kind of humility that had become part of his public voice, the steps he had taken to make amends. Bruna spoke about responsibility, about negotiation, about the pride of seeing a school with books on a shelf. They told the truth, that the mistaken identity, her thinking he was a chauffeur, his deciding to remain unknown, had been a catalyst that required courage, oversight, and the willingness to fix what one had broken. The bold moves had not been showy. They were practical. Apologies given in public and private, contracts written and honored, committees formed with external voices, and a relationship disclosed and recused when necessary. In the end, the mistake that started the story became less a scandal than a test of character. Some of the tests were institutional, others were deeply personal. Both had to be passed for their lives to move forward. Bruna walked often through Igarapava in the slow afternoons, sometimes with a notebook and sometimes with nothing at all. Once she paused on a small porch where she had once stood as a child and watched the light toss itself through the sugarcane. Rodrigo stood beside her, and neither spoke. The air held the sound of insects and the distant call of a dog.
She thought of the tiny paper square she had kept for months, the breadcrumb that had led to everything. And then she tucked a new kind of memory into the fold of her life. Not a breadcrumb, but a map. When the project's first major report came back, it contained numbers that mattered. Jobs created, roofs mended, children served. But what moved Bruna most was a line in a letter from a teacher. "We have books now, and that has changed the way children think about tomorrow." She read the sentence aloud to Rodrigo, and he smiled as though the words had been made for him. They had both learned, in different ways, that power must be handled like a tool, not a weapon. They had learned that mistakes demanded more than apologies. They demanded repair. And they had learned that affection could be built on shared labor and tempered by the discipline of accountability. Days unfolded. Contracts were renewed. The foundation found new donors. And the pilot program's methods were adopted elsewhere. Bruna moved between the city and her hometown less as someone who had been saved and more as someone who had come into her own. Her choices multiplied. Professional conferences where she spoke on community engagement. A small mentoring role with interns who had grown up in towns like Igarapava. Evenings when she taught a workshop on grant writing to local leaders. Their story, when retold, always circled back to the same image. A car in the rain, a kitchen with a kettle hissing on the stove, a small paper card left like a breadcrumb. It was part happenstance, part error, and part the certainty that people could choose to make amends. That was the lesson they carried forward and the quiet invitation at the heart of what they built. At the end of the day, on a street washed by a light rain that smelled like the city and something like beginnings, Bruna slipped her hand into Rodrigo's. They walked without hurry. The past had its weight, but it had also taught them how to carry things carefully. When they reached the corner by the cafe, Rodrigo stopped and looked at her with a steadiness that had been earned. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" she asked, though she had a guess. "For listening," he replied. "For holding me accountable. For every hard hour you turned into work that helped people. For not letting my mistake become a story about you." She smiled, warm and real. "And thank you for making the hard choice to be honest." They crossed the street, and the city hummed around them. Imperfect, loud, alive. She felt the steady click of her shoes on the pavement, and thought of the distance she'd walked from that first night. It had been a long route, full of negotiation and truth-speaking, but it had led to a life where choices were purposeful and affection was shared. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes in second chances and long work. Subscribe for more tales where a single night can unspool into a life remade.